Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to speak. This morning I'm going to talk about the OBOE Operations in 1945. In Australia, in the Australian Army, we spend a lot of time banging on about Gallipoli. Gallipoli this, Gallipoli that, Gallipoli. I would argue that the OBOE Operations in terms of the development of the Australian Army, in terms of its professional attitude, in terms of relevance to what it has to do in more recent times, are something we must pay much more attention to. There is much to learn. The Australian Army in the Second World War, up until this point, had largely been an organisation that fought battles, very tactically focused. Here, it has a series of almost separate campaigns that were orchestrated into a larger whole, and we see here in the OBOE Operations it grappling to transform itself from an organisation with a tactical focus that fights battles to one that conducts campaigns. We'll look first at the operational and strategic context. That the strategic context for these operations could fill several hours of discussion and debate all on its own, but we need some strategic context to place subsequent thematic discussions in context. This presentation is not going to go into a narration of tactical actions step by step, day by day. We're dealing with three separate operations across the space of time from May until the end of August 1945. We don't have the time to do that. What I'll be doing is tackling the topic in a thematic sense, trying to illustrate and discuss some of the themes that the Brigadier has already introduced. We'll look at planning and command decision making, the question of achieving local dominance, that as a historian I continually see what I would regard as old wine stuck in new bottles. We talk these days about anti-access and area denial and how this is a modern challenge that we confront. Yeah, but the Japanese did their very best to deny access, stop the Australians getting ashore. So there are significant A2AD issues to discuss with this campaign. Talk about force projection, logistics and sustainment. That when you're sending 60,000 troops, 6,000 kilometres from the Australian mainland, you better be able to resource them and resupply them, and there's a significant amount of staff work and organisation which goes on to do so. We'll look at joint and combined arms action. I'm looking at this in a broad sense, traditional combined arms in terms of the integration of joint fires, armour, engineers, etc. But also in that area, I'll discuss civil military operations and the integration of special forces. Talk about the littoral manoeuvre, but the use of the littoral is 10 years ago in the Australian Army we spoke a lot about it. Despite the fact we now have big grade boats and are looking at regional force projection, we seem to speak about it less as a concept, but it's particularly relevant in parts of British Borneo where these operations are occurring. There'll be some reflections from me and then plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end, because I get the sense that this is what today is about, so please don't feel reticent about contributing when we get to that stage. Okay. As I said, the strategic rationale of these operations is much debated. Some of them don't make a lot of sense to modern eyes. By this point in time, the Netherlands East Indies here, the original reason that the Japanese go to war for the rubber, the oil, the tin, the vast natural wealth that these islands held, the war has moved past. The United States forces have moved into the Philippine Islands. MacArthur has made his great return. And now the efforts of the United States are focused on the on the possible invasion of the Japanese home islands, beginning in late 1945, moving into 1946. And so immediately we see Australian involvement in Borneo as being in a strategic backwater. And a lot of the senior Australian officers involved in planning these operations recognise this. That General Frank Berryman who's the most senior staff officer in the Australian Army, perhaps in terms of his influence at this point in time, second only to General Blaney. He writes in his diary, when the landings in Okinawa occur in April, that the war has now passed Australia by. The OBOE operations originate in MacArthur's Montclair Plan of February 1945, but ideas for a return to the Netherlands East Indies had been being kicked around since at least September of the previous year. Montclair involves two sets of operations. The first being Victor, see up here, the liberation of the southern Philippines, and the second set of operations being OBOE, the liberation of the Netherlands East Indies, in what we would see today principally as central Indonesia. These operations are all about land-based air power. As in the New Guinea operations before them, it is about establishing land bases to mount air operations and then extending the land operations under the cover of air envelopes. OBOE 1 was to occur on the small island of Tarakan off the coast of northern Borneo. Its principal objective was to capture an airfield to extend the air envelope. You need to remember at the time that Allied airfields were in the southern Philippines and over here in western New Guinea. So to extend the air envelope across northern Borneo. OBOE 2 was to be at the town of Balikpapan, further down the east coast of Borneo, again principally about extending that air envelope, securing more territory for the Air Force to then move on again to OBOE 3 at Banjarmasin. Again, another airfield, all putting Allied air power closer to the main objective, which was Java. OBOE 4 was to be the landing in Java, potentially a 3-divisional operation, possibly in Surabaya, maybe around Batavia. OBOE 5 was a very ill-defined operation with not a lot of detail to it that was going to push into the central Netherlands Indies. And then OBOE 6 was to secure what was referred to in an offhand fashion as British Borneo. The territories of Sarawak, British North Borneo and the Sultanate of Brunei. Now, the other imperatives going on here, aside from the operational ones of securing the bases for air power, that this, as we discussed before, is very resource rich, particularly oil. Tarakan, Balikpapan, British Borneo, the major sites of oil production in addition to Sumatra for Netherlands East Indies oil. And the intent was thinking, well, if we go to Japan, these operations are going to be very resource intensive. Several senior American commanders in both the Navy and the Army had concerns about the quantities of oil which was flowing across the Pacific. So there was an idea that perhaps the oil facilities in Borneo could be resurrected and that oil, much closer to the sources of the operations, be employed in taking Allied troops to Japan. Now, ultimately, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff scotched OBOEs 3 to 5. They said, our main effort now is Japan. What are we mucking around in Borneo for? Now, this shows, due to an extent, that Australia's fortunes in this part of the war were essentially decided by somebody else, being the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff and to a lesser extent the combined Chiefs of Staff of the United States and the United Kingdom. A mishmash of imperatives propelled those operations which did occur. And ultimately there was little strategic or operational coherence to them. The Joint Chiefs of Staff prioritised Operation OBOE 6 in British Borneo. They wanted to tether the British Pacific Fleet to the Southwest Pacific for political reasons, keep them away from the operations against the main Japanese home islands, and also to hasten United Kingdom the United Kingdom taking control of the Southwest Pacific. The plan at this point in the war was this area that MacArthur, the Americans, the Australians have been operating in since 1942 would ultimately come under British control, freeing the Americans to focus on Japan. Now, it was recognised that OBOE 1 to Tarakan would still be needed to provide a forward airfield to support Operation OBOE 6. But with the demise of Java, the operations down the east coast of Borneo lost any real significance. Well, the demise of Java as an objective. But OBOE 2 to Balikpapan was still conducted. The justification remains very murky, and historians, and even me and some of my colleagues argue, we should debate and discuss why OBOE 2 happened. One contributing factor is possibly a personal undertaking from General MacArthur, commander of the Southwest Pacific Theatre, to the Dutch government in exile, saying, I will liberate the Netherlands East Indies for you. Dutch were quite keen to get it back. They had years of occupation. They wanted the resources. They wanted the income coming from it. Can't rule out MacArthur's ego in this. By capturing parts of the Netherlands Indies, he can say essentially he has liberated his entire command, being the Southwest Pacific Command, which in its original form stretched all the way from the Northern Solomons to Borneo and Java. We've talked about the oil supplies. Capturing parts of Borneo also provided airfields to project an airstream out to the southwest to prevent Japanese interference once the bulk of American forces, etc., moved on. And some of MacArthur's staff officers say that he still entertained plans of going to Java. But if there was an appropriate window while the operations for Japan geared up, he would still use the Australian Corps and seek to liberate Java. As ultimately conducted, OBOE 1 to Tarakan with the 26th Australian Brigade of the 9th Australian Division occurred on the 1st of May 1945. Tarakan Island, just here. Then, out of sequence, we had OBOE 6 to British North Borneo on the 10th of June 1945, with landings initially at Brunei Bay and on Labuan Island off the coast, then extending to further operations around the hinterland for Brunei Bay and down towards the Brunei oil fields. So landings initially here, and then this is the oil producing region there. And then finally, Balikpapan, 1st of July 1945, last amphibious operation of the war, last operation of the war by the Western Allies, not the Allies in total, because the Soviets conducted some major operations in the final days of the war against the Japanese, but last Western operation of the war, last amphibious operation of the war on the 1st of July. So planning and command decision making. Planning was shaped by the strategic and operational decision making going on in the Pacific at this stage of the war. As we've spoken about, the focus was on Japan. The United States was trying to divest itself of engagements that didn't focus on Japan. It was also seeking, for political reasons, to make sure that the British Commonwealth had something to keep itself busy and did not interfere in those operations to allow America essentially to claim the Pacific as its sphere of influence in the post-war era. Relations between MacArthur and his Australian counterparts were faltering. They thought that particularly after the Philippines, where the Australian forces had been denied a role, they thought that the information coming out of MacArthur and his headquarters was not always as honest as it could be. They also, some of the senior officers thought that MacArthur had an undue influence on Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. Planning was also influenced by a distinct separation between the Australian headquarters, the troops, and the objective areas. As we will see, once these campaigns are commenced, the bulk of the Australian troops and units are around here. They're in North Queensland. They're on the Atherton Tableland, they're around Cairns, they're around Townsville. They've been here since they come out of New Guinea in 1944, training, preparing, getting ready for the next campaign, which they thought was going to be the Philippines. The mounting base as we will see, is a place called Morotai. The passage of information from Morotai is essentially by airborne courier, and it takes 3 days. So the planning is influenced by what eventually is a separation between planning teams, main headquarters, and the troops and stores which are going to be used to conduct the landings. Australia is also struggling to maintain relevance at this point in time. It needs to be seen to be fighting, to playing a role in the defeat of Japan, so that it, like everybody else, can sit at the peace table once the war is over and seek to pursue its own political objectives in particularly Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Planning is also constrained by limited resources, by shipping, by amphibious tractors, by other key enablers, so much so that although there are 3 quite tightly scheduled operations, some of the key resources need to be used by each, which affects the scheduling and the timetables. And the shape of the operations are changing as the Australians plan. There were 6 operations, as we've seen on the cards, on the 18th of April 1945, when the 9th Australian Division first began to plan. It began concurrently planning for Operation OBOE 1, which would be conducted with its 26th Brigade, and Operation OBOE 2, which the remainder of the division would conduct. But on the 18th of April, it was ordered to cease work on OBOE 2 and start planning Operation OBOE 6 with a target date of the 23rd of May, less than a month away. So all the planning which had been done didn't quite get binned. It was passed on subsequently to the 7th Division, but it was a definite greatcoats on, greatcoats off moment. The shortest timelines of planning with the 7th Division, commanded by Major General Edward T. Milford. It was warned for Operation OBOE 2 in late April. The notice was particularly short. There were shipping shortages which played havoc with the concentration of the force. Milford asked for air transport to take his planning teams to Morotai, but no, they had to go by sea, which of course then further delayed planning. They arrived on the 31st of May, had to build their own facilities, which delayed planning even further. Brigade orders were then due 11 days later, on the 11th of June, for embarkation on the 19th. So we see there them essentially planning what became the largest of the OBOE operations, although the 9th Division had done a considerable amount of work previously, in the space of about 2 weeks. Now, I hope that what you've got thus far already is the sheer scale of these operations. That just putting OBOE 1, Papa, into context, that the 7th Division eventually takes about 30,000 troops and Royal Australian Air Force personnel and attached Americans and Dutch and various bits and pieces there. On the first day at Balikpapan, just under 15,000 Australian troops go across the beach. So I point this out to let's keep the achievements here, hold them up. But I think also, so let us not be overwhelmed by current tasks and current thinking. That what we are asked to do today, in many ways, is a very small, much smaller task. Now, the command arrangements for these are a little confusing. There is no joint commander as we would envisage it today. MacArthur, for purposes perhaps of his own control, for purposes of his own ego, made limitations in the way that the American system thought about operations. There was no overall joint commander appointed. Component commanders negotiated through the Southwest Pacific, negotiated with MacArthur for resources, for roles in their campaigns. This meant that when the OBOE operations were planning, there wasn't a lot of joint planning going on. There was planning being conducted by air components, by naval components, by air components, but not in the same place at the same time. They came together periodically for coordinated conferences and then went away again. Just to provide an example, this is the command arrangement for Operation OBOE 1, which is the 26th Brigade landing at Tarakan. So you have General Headquarters Southwest Pacific sitting up here. MacArthur's headquarters by this point in time based in the Philippines. That he has 3 component headquarters, Allied Land Forces, which Allied Land Forces Main is at that point in time in Brisbane. It's essentially an Australian headquarters. It then has advanced land headquarters in Landia, in Dutch New Guinea, and a very small forward element with MacArthur in the Philippines. Allied Air Forces, again, essentially an American headquarters with Australian attachments, and Allied Naval Forces. Now, these are all multinational organisations with American, Australian, Dutch, some limited British elements, but the main headquarters are dominated by the Americans just simply due to the preponderance of resources and troops and assets they have in the theatre. That's the main Australian Force component. 1st Australian Corps, the 9th Australian Division, and then 26th Infantry Brigade, which is used for the Tarakane landings. Allied Land Forces, as I said, is essentially an Australian headquarters. Advanced echelon of Allied Land Headquarters in the Philippines essentially acts as what we would recognise today as a national headquarters. It works and represents the interests of 1st Australian Corps with headquarters Southwest Pacific, negotiating resources, negotiating timetables. Principal oversight, however, is with Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead commanding 1st Australian Corps. And Morshead, if we are looking for a joint commander, is as close as we get. Because he is the one who commands, who conducts the coordinated conferences, arbiters in disputes between the air and naval component commanders. And this is the other major Australian force element here. Much of the air power here is from RAF Command at this time in the war. These problems with the command structure impact upon planning the operations. For example, for Operation OBOE, that the timetables for the United States Navy planning procedures for the amphibious landing meant that the landing component had to allocate troops to landing craft to the various assault waves before they'd actually finalised their tactical plans. We also had core shipping priorities that impacted upon, it's General Berryman there, who, as I said before, one of the most senior Australian officers during the war, probably second most influential to Blamey, and his principal staff officers at Advanced Land Headquarters. Shipping priorities affected the concentration and the planning. For example, poor allocation of shipping meant that the advanced parties of the 21st Brigade's battalions for Operation OBOE, they were put on slow-moving landing ship tanks. The best contemporary example, for those of you who remember the Tobruk, is something like the Tobruk. Troops put on there in Cairns Council, then shipped all the way to Mauritania. So the battalion advance parties were put there. The rest of the battalions were put on, the rest of the battalion troops were put on conventional troop ships. So what that meant was the battalion main bodies arrived at Mauritania before the headquarters staffs. Now the COs had gone to Mauritania earlier with the brigade planning team, so essentially the brigade COs were having to conduct their planning by themselves without the support of their staff. The general mood within the 7th Division is conveyed by Brigadier Ivan Doherty, commander of the 21st Brigade, who writes in his diary on the 20th of June, quote, "Told conference at 08:30 yesterday I decided not to have a row unless it was necessary. Managed to avoid having a row all day." So it's tense. There's a bit of pressure going on. You know, this is a large operation. Things aren't going as smoothly as perhaps people would like. Ultimately, though, the post-operations reports about these operations are relatively sanguine about the plan. And the core post-op report quotes, in all, the planning was carried out under difficulties. These problems were not individually large or difficult, but together they caused a lot of extra work in time which could be ill afforded. On the other hand, a long planning period often produces a swarm of minute questions and priorities, or imagined priorities to be talked about and argued over, and in practically no case did they affect the ultimate outcome of the operation. We were saved this. Now, much store in the post-operation reports was put on the experience of the divisions involved. That 7th and 9th Division had fought in the Middle East, had fought against the Japanese in 1942, 1943, early 1944. And throughout this training period, 44-45, had done a lot of exercising. The headquarters staffs had been involved in a prolonged core level staff exercise, planning a 3-divisional landing. So a lot of the staff processes, the procedures, the duties, the methods had been worked out, had been tested, had been tried. The OBOE planning was also cumulative, with each operation succeeding each other. The post-operations reports note that bumps in the planning processes were lined out. Procedures were smooth. The Operation OBOE 2 particularly learned a great deal from the planning of Operations OBOE 1 and OBOE 6. And we have to remember too that what I said before, that this army now, although largely a volunteer force enlisted for the duration of war, has all the hallmarks of a long-term serving regular army. That in the 7th Division, for example, all 3 brigade commanders had commanded as brigade commanders in a previous campaign in New Guinea. The infantry battalions represented a similarly unprecedented collection of experience in war. This is the command team for the 21st Brigade here. You have Brigadier Ivan Docky, who was the youngest battalion commander in the Australian Imperial Force in 1940-1941. All of his COs had also been captains and majors earlier on in the war, and the brigade command team itself had all done a campaign together in New Guinea in 1943-1944. They knew each other, they knew each other's skills, they trusted each other, and similarly in the battalions you had around each of the commanders you had a hardcore of experienced officers and staff. They also had, and we talked about in some of the guidance that I was provided, was look at what information was available, how situational awareness contributes to these campaigns, that they had an unprecedented amount of information. A great deal of it facilitated, particularly by the fact that Japanese control the air and Japanese control the sea in these areas of waned. That aerial reconnaissance was relatively easy, that there was a great deal of information able to be gleaned from the former Dutch settlers then who had been evacuated to Australia, many of whom were serving in the Netherlands East Indies forces in exile. There were geographic studies, there were terrain studies. The initial intelligence summary is about this thick. Unprecedented amounts of information. The brigades and battalions set up information centres where troops could just pop in. They had, you can barely see here because of the way that the screen has formatted itself, but big 3-dimensional plan maps. Each brigade had one in its brigade information centre. Troops were able to walk in, familiarise themselves. Every NCO was given an aerial photo of their objectives. The amount of information which the assault forces had access to was unprecedented. So that brings us to this question of sort of achieving local dominance, of about being able to reverse Japanese attempts to deny access to the landing beaches. The regional Japanese air and naval threat was significantly reduced. By this point in time, the Japanese were suffering quite badly, that they had a small naval element operating out in Singapore, but it still had fuel, it still had ships, it still had a threat potential. There are also small numbers of aircraft operating from Sumatra, from some airfields in Borneo, that, although considered not to seriously hamper operations, still pose a threat to particularly some of the slow-moving shipping. The local threat, the objective area, was entirely ground-based. See there the original estimates of Japanese ground troops in the objective areas, and then ultimately the strength which was found at landing. Some cases the estimates were over, some cases the estimates were under. Balikpapan was the most heavily defended, probably Tarakan thereafter. There wasn't a lot of defences in British Borneo because the Japanese had concentrated their effort on the Sandakan side. They originally thought that any operations would come against northeastern Borneo. When they did a strategic reassessment at the end of 1944, they recognised actually the threat was probably more likely to come in the vicinity of the oil fields, and then they commenced a vast overland movement of their troops. It's a slight aside to what we're concerned with today, but this is the added context to the movement of Australian prisoners of war out of Sandakan. It was part of a general Japanese movement of all of its military operations from the northeast of Borneo across overland to the northwest. And their combat troops marched across the mountains, and as a result, only about a third of them arrived in Brunei. Balikpapan, as I said, most heavily defended. Significant field works in terms of anti-tank ditches, beach obstacles, etc. Large numbers of coastal defence guns, 79 guns of varying calibers from 20mm up to 155mm, some of which, if you go to Balikpapan today, in places where the locals can't get them out for scrap, you can still find them. The Dutch had tried to defend this place. There's still a lot of Dutch concrete around in various places in Balikpapan. The Japanese put this to good use, as well as digging their own defensive positions as well. The other great Australian fear was the use of burning oil. In Balikpapan, the oil storage facilities in 1945 sat up on top of ridge lines not far from the beach. The big Australian concern was that the Japanese would open up the stopcocks, set the oil alight, and there would be streams of burning oil flowing down re-entrance to the beach. It hasn't reproduced very well here, but this again is just an emphasis of how much the Australians knew about where they were going. This is Mangard Airfield, which is up the coast from the main populated area of Balikpapan, one of the eventual Australian objectives. And you can see all of this red overprint here is Japanese defences which have been identified. And you take these overprint maps to places like Balikpapan and Parakan, etc. these days, and you go to where these overprints are, and if it's not settled, you hunt around, you will usually find remnants of whatever has been indicated there in 1945. So again, a lot of knowledge of how these places were defended. Let's look at OBOE 1 as an example of how the preliminary operations are functioning, how Japanese A2AD efforts were being countered. 1st of July was D-Day for Balikpapan. There are air operations going on from late May. And these are obviously integrated into operations which have been occurring for the other two OBOEs as well. Principal aim to stop any Japanese air interference. So they are attacking airfields across the archipelago. What they are also doing is seeking to reduce the Japanese defences at Balikpapan, particularly the coastal defence guns and the anti-aircraft guns, to enable that local dominance at the time of the landing. Because the other thing that we need to consider here is that this area was heavily mined, that the Dutch had mined it for defensive purposes in 1941. The Japanese had mined it for their own defensive purposes during their occupation. And Australia and the United States had also sown more mines from airborne, from aircraft, principally Catalinas, in order to shut down Japanese shipping. So this place was ripe with mines, and you could not bring an amphibious task force in there without clearing them. There were 16 days of mine sweeping under Japanese coastal defence fire. So when we're talking about coastal defence guns, we're just talking about dumb guns with big iron shells, but still enough to sink several of the American minesweepers involved in the clearance operations. There was a concentrated air bombardment of the facilities ashore, principally to deal with the coastal defence guns, but also to knock out the remainder of the oil facilities. And this brings to mind an interesting question about how the tactical objectives and the tactical means conflict with the operational objectives. One of the operational objectives of Balikpapan was to secure the oil facilities and reconstitute them as quickly as possible. But then the tactical imperative was to destroy the oil so that it couldn't be used as a weapon against Australian troops. So what this did was basically smash what was left of the oil facilities. And of course the Americans had spent 1943, 1944 trying to bomb the oil facilities into submission anyway to stop the Japanese getting them. So there is a lack of continuance in American strategic planning here, but Gavin Long, the Australian official historian, reports in 1945 when he visits Balikpapan that the oil facilities are of use to nobody but scrap dealers. There's also, when we get to logistic issues, that across the OBO objective areas, the Air Force does its job too well. It destroys the port facilities, it destroys the public infrastructure, it destroys the road, it destroys the airfields, it destroys the oil facilities. It does its job, and particularly at the time, it is accused by both the Dutch and by some people in the army of a little bit bomb happy, because particularly the oil facilities and the airfields and ports, which are things which the attacking force thus needs itself, aren't available. And this is something which perhaps needs to be considered when we're looking at how you sustain ultimately a force which is made in amphibious lodgement. You can't put things across the beach forever. So jetties, port facilities, wharves, the roads to get supplies away from them are vital. The Japanese had put obstacles along all the beaches, so there was some obstacle clearances which needed to be done. At Tarakan, an Australian engineer field squadron did this. Some of you have probably seen the very famous photos of the blokes standing, looking very worn, covered in mud, because the beach at Tarakan is just mud. Oily, slimy, smelling mud, still is. And at Balikpapan done by American clearance divers. So again, we see this layer of breaking through the Japanese defences to put our forces ashore through the amphibious lodgement. And finally, as the troops are coming ashore, conducting their operations and then making the transition to land operations, there is a firepower-centric approach to the operation. The Australian Army by this point in the war is a very cautious organisation. It is committed to using firepower to save lives. It does not want a repeat of the very badly resourced and very costly operations, particularly along the north coast of Papua at the end of 1942, early 1943. That the two commanders, in many ways, are quite similar in their approach. General Mudguts Wooten on this side, if you've ever seen a bigger photo of him, he's huge. You see him sitting in a jeep, he's spilling out over the sides of it. He was a light horse officer in the First World War. I hope that he was a little bit lighter then because I pity his poor horse. But very sharp brain underneath, the huge girth. He'd been a brigade commander in the Middle East. He commanded the Australian Training Organisation in the Middle East. He then led the 9th Division through several amphibious landings in New Guinea in 1943. Lae and Finschhafen are the ones I speak of. He'd been a little bit headstrong earlier on. His brigade had quite heavy casualties at Buna in late 1943. But in the Lae and Finschhafen operations, he was subsequently chided for a methodical approach to clearing the hinterland as his troops advanced along the New Guinea coast. One of his brigade commanders commented he was the shrewdest divisional commander I'd encountered. He was sound, he was sure, and he was careful. Teddy Milford here, there's two sides of the Australian Army at this point in time. Wooten, lawyer by training, he was originally a professional soldier, got out during the Depression when the Army was putting people on permanent enforced leave and dropping pay, subsequently became a lawyer, so served on as a citizen soldier. Milford here, career regular soldier right through, artillery officer. He was well read, strong-willed, proven also as divisional commander and senior staff officer in New Guinea in 1943-1944. Very quiet man, and his quiet demeanour raised suspicions amongst some of his colleagues. General Morset, the commander of 1st Australian Corps, regarded him as a misanthropist, somebody who just doesn't like people. But that again, that sort of quiet, careful demeanour earned the respect of his troops. And you see this in his decisions about Balikpapan. When you're conducting amphibious lodgements, one of the basic decisions that need to be made, do you land immediately on the objective area or do you land off the objective area and advance to it? So Milford is facing this decision with Balikpapan. The main facilities, the port, the population centres, the oil, the Japanese defences are concentrated down here in the south. He has 2 airfields that he needs to capture, one at Sepenyang here, one at Mangara up here. 4 possible landing beaches. He can either land up here in the vicinity of Mangara and then advance in a vaguely easterly direction upon his objective, or he can land immediately on his objective. Now, he's had the experience of these campaigns in New Guinea. He's an artillery officer. He sees the preponderance of resources that he's got. And he recognises that if he lands here and advances down the coastal highway, this is all jungle and hills here, that the multiple creek lines, the multiple rivers here give the Japanese ample opportunity to slow his advance, impede his capture of the key facilities he needs to sustain his force. This bit here, going directly onto the objective, potentially more risky, but he has considerable amounts of firepower, and his calculations here is that large amounts of firepower means that he can neutralise the Japanese, and in the initial shock he can get his troops ashore and establish before they have time to respond. And that's ultimately the decision he makes. Utilising the resources that he has to maximise shock, get ashore, and make sure that his forces are not going to be bogged down and delayed by a long progressive advance. The operations that then both at Tarakan and at Balikpapan are quite similar, heavily dependent upon indirect firepower to suppress Japanese positions before the infantry advance on them. At Balikpapan, this approach is referred to as probe it, blast it, occupy it, using patrols to violate Japanese positions, bringing down the Australian preponderance in indirect fire support, and then sending in the infantry to occupy it thereafter. We're sending troops a long way from home, 6,000 kilometres. Force projection is important. The main problem that I've alluded to is a shortage of shipping. There was a shortage of cargo shipping across the Allied forces at this point in the war. There just wasn't enough to do what was going on in Europe. There was logistics which had to be shipped across the Atlantic to continue to sort of fight the war against Germany. The shipping was being marshalled to commence the operations against Japan, and then you had all the shipping which was needed just for everyday maintenance. So both a shortage of heavy shipping and amphibious shipping. So it was the principal limitation in building up the force. That logistical handicaps tended also to outweigh tactical concerns in some senses. The American headquarters was continually trying to force down Australian force levels, so to save shipping, and the American head of intelligence was at times accused of reducing estimates of Japanese strength in objective areas in order to argue for a reduction in shipping. If you look at a lot of the intelligence estimates, and this is an ongoing battle between American and Australian intelligence staffs, Australian intelligence estimates are usually quite high, American much lower, and usually the Australians come in much closer to the actual Japanese strength on the ground. Perhaps the most scary of these sort of instances where the logistical handicaps were outlaying the tactical concerns, that shortages of shipping meant that essentially the better part of one of General Wotton's brigades for OBOE 6 was delayed. And in order to try and meet his timetable, that a half-baked plan was come up within his headquarters to conduct the operation without necessary troops. And this is where that forward element at McArthur's headquarters really earned its money. That this revised plan went up through. General Berryman, his principal staff, said, this is just nonsense, this is risky, don't do this, and then intervened on behalf of Australia, 1st Australian Corps and the 9th Division at McArthur's headquarters and said, hey, let's just delay for a little while until this force is assembled. Because Wood was going to go ashore without any of his artillery, for example. without a lot of his combat troops, without any of his artillery, and it's the one brain snap that you see in a generally deft handling of a campaign by Wootton. Talking about these issues of force projection, that generally the troops embarked in Townsville and Morotai, Townsville and Cairns, shipped around the north coast of New Guinea to the island of Morotai here in the Halmaduras, and then from there on to the objective areas. So 4,500 kilometres, about a 4 or 5 day voyage, and then from Morotai on to the islands, which, as I said, creates all sorts of problems with the establishment of building the force up at Morotai. Particularly the heavy organisations, the engineers, all their PORs are screaming about the fact that ultimately they have to conduct the operations with a lot of the heavy kit and a lot of particularly the base area organisations because they just don't arrive in time. And the scheduling, as I've seen, is very tight because of the way that the troops arrive. And a lot of them arrive not particularly match fit because they have to travel all the way from Northern Australia to Morotai through tropical conditions, basically under canvas on the deck of LHCs, sleeping in the back of vehicles, under vehicles, doing their ablutions over the side of the ship, and then, particularly for the 7th Division, they don't have very much time ashore to acclimatise. And Fred Chilton, the commander of the 18th Brigade, writes afterwards that if we required our troops to have a really serious fight, they keep making references, if we'd been required to fight the Germans, we would have been in a much worse state because our troops weren't as match fit as they could have been because of travelling in conditions like these. Once they're ashore, there's multiple issues. Now, there's a lot of planning goes on, but some common issues come out of the POR. One is this issue of tactical loading, of putting things on ships in the order that they need to come off, of putting the stores which are needed on the first day, easily accessible, in vehicles, so the vehicles are driven off or they're carried off on command. There are repeated instances of pieces of kit particularly required by the technical units which just aren't there when they're needed. That's complicated also by some of these failures in joint cooperation, where particular units, particular items of kit are put down to be unloaded on the first day and perhaps don't arrive until the 4th. So there's a degree of confusion. So the points which come out is that there needs to be closeness of cooperation between the Army and Navy to make sure that ships get in where they're meant to be, that stores where they are, and that particularly things which you need are not stored in bolt-on ships, they are on vehicles that can just be driven off. But this creates another problem. The engineers get a bit of a whack for not packing their stores in loads small enough that can be got off the ships, and there's a lack of an amphibious mindset among some force elements, and without any offence to our hosts here, it's generally the Air Force. That they've not conducted as much amphibious operations as the Army. They don't have an amphibious mindset at the time. Their trucks are heavily overloaded and they are carrying a whole bunch of stuff. Milford writes that they even bring latrines with them. So they create all manner of problems then with beach control. Heavily laden trucks becoming bogged on the beaches, clogging up the beach exits. Although the Australian Army by this point in time has organisations called beach groups, about 1,800 personnel consisting of a pioneer battalion, some engineers, some MPs, basically to control and marshal the beach. In key areas, particularly military policemen to control the traffic, get the beach cleared, keep traffic moving, they find that they don't have enough. And so both at Tarakan and on Loveline Beach, and to a lesser extent at Ballot Cup, there are problems getting vehicles off the beach and getting the beachhead established. Long-term sustainment. The assault convoys carried 15 days of stores. 15 days. It varied, with some stores, but basically 15 days worth of operations. That they also had a float reserve packages allowing for another 10 days of operations. So worked out on historical usage rates, supplies of ammunition, fuel, rations, etc. aboard the ships, ready to be offloaded should that be required. As I noted before, there was problems with the build-up of supplies ashore due to the damage of the port facilities. That a cargo ship was not brought alongside at Balikpapan until, for example, D+11, because the piers at Balikpapan port had been so severely blasted and burned. But that brings with it another requirement for the assaulting force, that if you're going to blast piers and port facilities, make sure you have plenty of engineers there to restore them thereafter. Ongoing sustainment was scheduled from Australia. But again, on the basis of historical usage rates, divisional packages of all manner of stores had been packaged up. And these were put on ships and were to be dispatched on a monthly basis from Australia. So moving on to issues of combined arms. The Australian Army had its armour infantry tactics relatively well worked out by this point in time. They developed them in New Guinea in 1943, 1944. The armoured units, the armoured squadrons had trained with the infantry in Queensland during 1940, 1944, 1945, and those units that had time also further refined the tactics and the procedures on Morotai before they went. Tanks were essentially used in a bunker busting capability to bring in a flamethrower or a howitzer and blast Japanese defensive positions. Again, as part of this firepower-centric approach to putting as much firepower on the positions before infantry were close with their objectives. The difficulties that were experienced with the armour was one of maintenance, again going back to this fact that shipping shortages meant that some of the heavier maintenance elements did not arrive on time. And so particularly some of the more technical pieces of armour, such as the bridge rail tanks, broke down and couldn't be repaired. But this was where organic AEME elements with the tank with the tank squadrons proved critical to keep particularly the gun tanks rolling. We look at a tank as being relatively, it's one of its characteristics is its mobility, that in all these places in Borneo, the tanks did not perform as well as would be expected. That it needed they needed close, much more closer reconnaissance was needed. Swampy ground, sandy ground meant that the tanks in many ways were just confined to tracks and the roads. Joint fires, commanders sought to have indirect fire available immediately upon landing. Naval gunfire support, very few problems with it, had its limitations due to the hills in some places. Various efforts were made to put artillery ashore with initial waves. At Labuan, they put guns in the back of alligators, which is a small tracked amphibious armoured personnel carrier type thing. At Brunei Bay, pack howitzers were put on landing craft. And at Balikpapan, it was 4.2-inch mortars, which proved to be vital, particularly some of the actions on the early on the 1st of July. The naval gunfire support failed due to communications. The tanks got bogged, the artillery wasn't sure yet, so the 4.2-inch mortars were the indirect fire support. There were difficulties with ground-air cooperation, largely because of a lack of practice. Quite a few blue-on-blue incidents there, but by and large, the command and control procedures were appropriately worked out. 4.2-inch mortar there. Mobility and counter-mobility concerns. That coming off these beachheads, there were relatively few egress routes. They were clearly identifiable because of the terrain, because of the vegetation. The routes that the Australians would take were obvious to the Japanese. They made extensive use of what we recognise today as improvised explosive devices to delay the Australian advance, to essentially conduct area denial in some places. A lot of obvious places to set up field parks, headquarters, etc., had to be cleared first because they were severely booby-trapped, and simply as nuisance a nuisance value. The forces found that they needed more engineers forward, particularly with the tanks, because the tanks were being delayed by road craters, and the infantry were having to progress without them. So large numbers of engineers were needed forward elements. And this also went back to the need for specialist engineer equipment, more bridging tanks, which weren't there, and there was also the maintenance communications. The other big thing that comes out in terms of counter mobility and mobility when operating in this part of the world, it is wet. Infrastructure is not particularly well developed, and drainage is important. When you then drop large numbers, large quantities of high explosive on it, the drainage system, suffers, and roads quickly become impassable. And this was one of the major concerns that they had within hours of these landings, was the state of roads, the state of drainage infrastructure, making egress and supply very difficult. Again, going back to the fact that lots and lots of engineers of all varieties were required. Special operations were conducted on an unprecedented scale in particularly British North Borneo. Approximately 150 operatives were put into British North Borneo in April and May of 1945. Largely British instigation to start flying the Union Jack, start reclaiming, bringing the people over, but also to conduct, to form guerrilla forces and conduct intelligence, to conduct reconnaissance prior to the landings. But there was confused command arrangements. The Allied Intelligence Bureau had very little to do with the conventional forces. There was liaison officers were exchanged, but by and large the Special Forces considered themselves to have an independent vision and do their own thing. And this resulted in essentially conflicting missions. The Special Forces saw themselves as their principal aim of raising guerrilla forces to fight the Japanese, which they did, and they did very successfully, because a lot of people in Borneo have a headhunting tradition which they've been stopped with doing since the days of the Brooks back in the late 19th century. Suddenly all these people were here saying, yeah, you can go and lock heads again as long as they're Japanese, and pay them money to do so. But what this did was stirred up a guerrilla war, ultimately, that these people did not have the capacity to sustain. What they were telling the guerrillas they were recruiting, that the conventional forces, when you land on the beach, and advance inland. Wooden's orders, however, were to capture the facilities along the coast, the airfields, the oil facilities, and then basically risk management stopped. So you end up then with a war, these people are fighting, and then as the Japanese were retreating to the coast, becoming severely pressed, which would have ended disastrously for quite a lot of their guerrillas had not the war ended when it did. Generally, because of the nature of the human intelligence that the Special Forces were gathering, some of it was unreliable, the conventional forces distrusted them, although at times cooperation could function very effectively. A place called Ready, the Special Forces and their guerrillas captured a key inland town on one of the major rivers, and thus, and thereafter the Australians, the conventional forces came upriver to garrison that town, so they worked effectively. Also worked very effectively with the Air Force, but with the main conventional forces, there was a disjunction between their operations. Civil military operations, large numbers of civilian ill and wounded, partly due to Japanese mistreatment, partly due to Indonesian labour forces brought in, partly due to the Allied bombardment. And once the Allied forces landing, they come out and they're seeking assistance, they are seeking medical treatment, and the forces aren't equipped to deal with it. There's a civil operations unit formed for British North Borneo. There are some Dutch civil operations people in Balikpapan, but none of them have the appropriate, really, have sufficient resources to deal with the scale of the problem. Like a lot of the technical elements, the civil affairs people had not been involved in the bulk of the planning. So again, you have significant difficulty here. Borneo at the time was largely roadless and trackless. Quite early on in the planning, looking at the terrain studies, it was identified that the opportunities that would be involved with utilising the littoral environment for movement. The Japanese were exploiting it to move their troops around, particularly using small craft at night. So it was both an issue of flank security, but also to move troops inland where there were no roads to do so. Littoral manoeuvre was employed in all of these campaigns, but perhaps most extensively in British Borneo. It had been identified early, but again, a shortage of small craft limited capability. But they were continually finding for small craft, particularly the small LCM, the grandfather of the LCM-8s, which I think still soldier on in the army today, but there are movements to replace them. And the LCM becomes the jack of all trades. But this then brings about a conflict between the continuing lighterage capabilities which are needed because port facilities are not adequate. The LCMs are needed to offload cargo ships offshore and bring supplies in. They're needed to move senior officers and various people around, and at the same time they're also needed to move upriver. This just gives an idea of the extent of the littoral operations in British North Borneo. That the initial landings are here on Labuan, here at Brunei Bay. There are then subsidiary amphibious landings over here on the north coast of Brunei Bay. That we see the operation right up the river here to Marudi, again done with small craft. That all of these red dots here, all bases established and maintained by small craft down off the Limbang River. And off here too, that there was another operation towards Beaufort, a advance mounted on 2 axes of advance, solely using LCM-8s to capture the town of, troops moved on LCM-8s to capture the town of Beaufort. So extensive use of the littoral environment. So some reflections. I'm going to get finished so you give me a chance to ask some questions. Let's start with the point that I worked with last, that Southeast Asia hasn't changed. It still has big wide rivers, they are still very navigable, that road infrastructure is still particularly poor. That if we are looking at force projection into archipelagic, Southeast Asia, South Pacific, that littoral manoeuvre is still going to be highly relevant. We need to be equipped for it, we need to train for it. The most recent white paper talks about re-energising what is essentially the Army's groundwater capability. Where that will go, I'm not sure. We see here 2 issues about planning. We see a lot of, right through the PORs, people talking about not having sufficient time for planning and not having sufficient staff to do it. But yet they mount these operations. They put 60,000 troops ashore. How are they able to do it? Because they have landing tables, because they have experience, because they have SOPs. So it shows both that to do things properly, planning needs to be properly resourced. And ideally, it takes time to get it right. But then also, the real world will often mean that operations need to be conducted in a hurry. There is not the time for the ideal planning, and so thus that's where there needs to be procedures, staff work, etc., that is in place to mean that these things can happen quickly. These operations in many sense may sound familiar to some of you, but a lot of the things that we do today, these operations just confirm that if you are going to integrate armour and infantry, for example, that the armour and the infantry needs to work together. It needs to know each other, they need to trust each other, they need to work out the procedures between them. In some cases here, those elements have been working together, the same squadron of tanks with the same infantry battalion for multiple years. That reconnaissance needs to be close. Despite the vast amounts of information which was here, what ultimately brought elements of these operations unstuck was that close person on the ground, eyeballing it, sticking their finger in the dirt. There were problems with egress off beaches that were identified as being suitable, but ultimately when people got there that weren't. We've talked about the problems that there were with the tank. And I guess if we're talking about what's relevant to us today, it's about developing an in-depth knowledge of the conditions throughout littoral Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, so that we have vast amounts of information, so we have that database there ready to go should we be required to do so. I think my final reflection, partly sort of beating the historian's drum, partly going back to my original point. In the Australian Army, we often spend a lot of time banging on about things which are of declining relevance to us. Whereas things such as this, we don't talk much about. I think we need to do a lot more exploration of where we are winning, of where we are succeeding, not of where we are retreating as ragged bloody heroes across the Dakota track getting our asses kicked. But when we are at the top of our game, when we have a preponderance of fire support at a time when we're able to put 15,000 people across a beach in a day and smash our enemy and move onwards to success. But this is the other thing I need that I guess emphasise too. Going back to my final point, to the scale of these operations, that we've been able to do this in the past, so we shouldn't be daunted. And I don't think we are daunted, but I guess it's a sort of just a word of encouragement more than anything else. We're feeling our way through how the Army works with the big grade boats that we have, and you know, the rumours that you hear occasionally is that what we do with them, that people are saying, oh, we can't do that, we can't do this. Yeah. We've done stuff like this in the past, we can do it again. And that's the point that I'm in on. So, questions, discussion?
Pratten, Grant Shot for Deputy Commander for 3 Brigade. Just a question regards the withdrawal and reconstitution with the shipping concerns. Can you give a sense of that, or was it just they sat there until the end of the war and the...
No, this was one of the problems, that because these operations were so tightly scheduled, that the logistics build-up needed to be done within a set timeline. Because the shipping, the amphibious tractors, the assault shipping, a lot of the cargo shipping, etc., that was used for Tarakan, then was used for Bruno Bay, then was used for Palakama, same stuff. So it was that if you didn't get it what you needed within what was about a 15-day window before the shipping had to be redeployed, you didn't get it. So the shipping was there, did its thing, moved on to the next operation. Some small residual sort of small craft and supporting craft done, but it was then, because it was so short, it was just there, moved on to the next operation. In terms of the forces there, ultimately there was just a very gradual wind down that particularly at Papua and in British North Borneo, there were Australian troops there until December 1945. Purely, A, because they had HABR type tasks, post-conflict reconstruction tasks to do. They had to disarm the Japanese, they had to round them up. There was a lot of reconstruction work to be done, particularly in those parts of the world that had a Union Jack flying over them that Australia felt responsible for. So Australia doesn't hand over civil affairs responsibilities in Borneo to Britain until again December 1945. But it's a progressive, it's not a planned redeployment of the troops or of the shipping in a way that we would see today. The campaigns essentially peter out. The troops are relocated from Parrot. The 9th Division is reconstituted in British North Borneo. 7th Div remains in Balikpapan, although various of its battalions are sent to parts such as Makassar and the Celebes to again take the Japanese surrender, do some of the HADR work, also keep the Indonesian independence movement in line, particularly in Makassar. But it peters out essentially. But the main point where it comes into play is 15 days. You need to know what you need, what your priorities are, and if it's not ashore, it's going to be coming on a very slow boat, who knows when.
Lieutenant Class from 3rd Command Service Support Battalion. Just further on from logistics, I just had a question regarding just the sheer size of the landing force, conflicting shipping priorities, as well as just structure local infrastructure in the area. Were there any significant delays to sustain operations as a result of potential delayed logistics in that theatre?
At no point in time did the operations ever struggle, come to a halt because of sustained issues. That on Tarakan there are ammunition, particularly ammunition shortages of tank ammunition, 25 pounder, and 3-inch mortar shell. But that's more a production issue rather than a shipping issue. There are multiple pieces of heavy equipment, etc., which don't arrive, and particularly the engineers, the Air Force construction squadrons to a degree suffer as a result of. One of the big things that doesn't arrive is a lot of the maintenance parts and a lot of the stores organisations to organise what the engineers bring ashore, and they feel that quite desperately. But we're saved at Valley Papa and Hurricane particularly because of the initial shock on the enemy. The Japanese are never able to really mount a coherent resistance to these landings, and thus a common comment that I made refer to before. We would have been in trouble in some instances we were fighting the Germans because there were some mistakes and because they didn't have to continue to be fighting a large-scale conventional fight, they were able to make do. But there was never any shortages of key stores at any point in time in terms of food, rations, ammunition. They planned the ammunition on high-intensity usage rates. There were some, very stiff fights in some places, but they didn't then need the ammunition to that scale. So the circumstance was forgiving on some of the issues with the shipping, and the delays in getting heavy stores across.
Hello, Aaron Garnham, S23RAR. I do have two questions. First is highlighting the troubles with planning.
Yeah.
At the time, with Australian headquarters, was there a culture or contingency planning? Was it primarily reactionary based on theatre command? And my follow-on question is highlighted some of the limitations we have or the support that came from allied nations. Without allied nation support, would it be achievable? And I think that might go to a large question about today about the level of force projection Australia has in a realistic sense, then and now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, there was a culture of contingency planning. That this is one of the things that particularly Australian Advanced Land Headquarters did. Once MacArthur's headquarters started talking about an idea, Advanced Australian Land Headquarters commenced a staff study. And if you look through the archives, there's a whole bunch of staff studies for operations that never occurred. One that brings to mind, there was planned for a 2-divisional landing in the North Philippines. There's vast amounts of paperwork, there's a staff study, a whole manner of stuff. It never happens. So this puts the divisional planning teams in a relatively good position once they start their planning. Because a staff study has been produced by Advanced Land Headquarters. They are given the staff study. It makes some recommendations in terms of objectives, in terms of force packages, in terms of how they be employed. Now, the divisions don't always adopt these, but they have the study, they have a bucket load of intelligence information that comes with it to guide their initial selection planning. So they're in a reasonable, they're in a reasonable state, and particularly with Valley Papa, there's a broader sense of contingency planning there. It's regarded as a harder nut to crack, and so Milford is building in contingency. Particularly, he's only given 2 brigades to begin with, and this is one of the arguments that occurs over the shipping. I need more shipping. I want my 3rd brigade as an afloat reserve in case things are tough. I want some medium guns. And he doesn't get the medium guns, he does get the extra brigade, but then that does mean a bit of argy-bargy between the Air Force and the Army because a whole bunch of Air Force construction troops are then left behind. So there is a culture of contingency planning going on. Second question just...
Allied enablers.
Oh, yeah, allied enablers. Yes, this couldn't happen without the allied enablers. That one of the major problems that the logisticians come out with, if you're conducting an amphibious operation, control your own sustainment shipping. But that's great, that's a great concept, but you've got to have it to control it. And it's very, and this I guess is, we've moved beyond the days where you can't, most nations could not, for example, do something like the British did in the Falklands anymore. Here's a whole bunch of our own merchant fleet, let's take them up from trade and turn them into and turn them into sort of shipping to support an amphibious campaign. But this could not have happened essentially without United States shipping support, both in terms of grey fleet and in terms of cargo vessels. That the bulk of the amphibious shipping was American, the bulk of the gunships were American, although there were Dutch, British and Australian ships represented amongst the fleet. There were some Australian amphibious ships, the original Nimbler and Nura were very important platforms here, but the bulk of the force projection in the initial landing is done by American shipping. The sustainment, the ongoing sustainment of these divisional level packs was going to be through Australian shipping. The Australians had to support themselves thereafter because the American shipping was going elsewhere. But bulk fuel, particularly avgas, diesel, petrol, lubricants, etc., are still going to be provided by the American system in the long-term sustainment plan through their network of tankers operating in this theatre. So it's an operation we put together, we coordinate, but without the enablers of our allies, it just wasn't possible. Yeah.
Dr. Pratten, when we look at the army that was mobilised for North Africa, subsequently blooded through Papua New Guinea, what were the parts of adaptation to the Japanese that were best captured to be applied in OBO? And as a corollary to that, how were lessons captured from those campaigns and then shared and applied?
Okay. Principal changes to the army from going from the Middle East through Papua to fighting to OBO were a reduction in the scale of the organisation. That was a significant reorganisation occurs in 1943 as a result of the early experience of Papua to slim the Australian down, to bring in tropical strength establishments. That the Australian Army in North Africa was very heavily motorised, that people talk about Germans and motorisation. The most heavily motorised army at the beginning of the Second World War was Britain. And Australia in the Middle East followed British patterns, that basically within the infantry battalion, every platoon had a little sort of pickup truck type ute thing to carry green guns and supplies. The whole thing could move on wheels. Comes back, it has to ditch all the transport, it slims down, loses its anti-aircraft guns, slims down its mortar platoon, makes itself fitted for travelling in small means of conveyance, being either C-47 or, again, going back to this idea of littoral manoeuvre, LCMs. The other thing that's developed, particularly through the campaigns of 1943, 1944, is the work of small combined arms teams, of small packets of engineers working with a troop of tanks, working with an infantry company. And you see a lot of this, particularly in the advance out of Finschhafen and along the coast of the German Peninsula. Of that is how they're working, using the tanks to deal with the Japanese defensive positions, infantry close with them, either indirect fire support or a lot of increasingly adept use of close air support. But there's a recognition by the time of Borneo, however, that there's not one tropical environment. There's a difference between mountain warfare in New Guinea and operation in littoral. And there's generally a recognition that fire support has been slimmed down a little bit too much by Borneo. The number of mortars in the mortar platoon is back up, for example, to give battalions then the means to have their own fire support should artillery not be forward, etc. The way Australia by this point in time has a very effective lessons learned organisation working. Under the Director of Military Training, a bloke called Brigade Irving does a lot of work again in 1943 in reforming the lessons learned organisation, in attaching people from the department, from the Director of Military Training as observers to brigades and divisions to do real-time reporting to complement that which is being done actually through the sort of the post-operations report system by the battalions, the brigades, divisions, etc. They're brought back to the division, the Director of Military Training, and they're then issuing this stuff back down in Army training memorandums and through the revisions of the Army Structured Warfare Doctrine, which is revised, testing my memory here, but I think is revised in late 1944. And you can see, looking at those Army training memorandums, they change progressively throughout the war. You look at them in 1941, 1942, they're largely stuff which has come from the UK. It's come out through Commonwealth channels and it's just repeated. You look at them in late 43, 44, yeah, there's still a lot of stuff from overseas, but it's all stuff relevant to jungle warfare. It's not about large-scale manoeuvre in the desert or on the plains of Europe. It's about infantry minor tactics. It's about small team coordination between tanks, engineers, etc. And so you've also, this long training period in 44, early 45, gives both the 7th and the 9th Division, which have had long experience in Papua New Guinea the previous year, embedding their experience. There's a lot of small conferences going on within battalions, within brigades. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? There's a lot of experimentation. I was looking at a report the other day just with how the 2nd 43rd Battalion was writing reports on it. It's exercises with its attached tank squadron. You know, this works, that works. The infantry is communicating on the wrong net, and so the tanks can't hear what's going on. We need to improve that. Don't use the phone on the back of the tank, it's a bit unreliable. That the infantry are leaving their tanks behind. You need to stay back, the tanks are vulnerable, help them clear obstacles and move forward, it's all good. So there's a whole bunch of work which is going on in 44, 45, and then in 44 being inculcated across the force to bring in these lessons learned that have been developed over the course of the previous year's campaign.
Phil Blake, Admin Company, 1RL. There's obviously a lot of parallels, albeit scalable, between now and then.
Yeah.
One area I don't see a parallel is our vehicle weights today, which are generally about 4 times heavier than they were then.
Yeah.
You've seen some of these environments. How do you think our modern log and fighting fleets would get on, bearing in mind that they're now 4 times the actual weight?
If I just go, if I look at, just let's use the modern day Pelican, Valley Company, etc. as an example. I think in some ways that's struggled. The roads in a lot of these places are little narrow roads, small narrow bridges. The beach conditions have not improved. Hurricane is still mud. That also drainage in these places remains particularly vital, and condition of the infrastructure not particularly good. There's a road called Snag, well, what was known to the Australians as Snag's Track, which runs across the hills in Cove. It was just a bit of a footpath, in 1945. When a colleague of mine went to Hurricane in 1995, it was a rutted dirt track with lots of mud and you couldn't pass vehicles through it. When I first went to Hurricane, it was a nice new resurfaced road. That was my first trip to Tarakan in 2014. When I went back to Tarakan with my students from work last year. This road, which 2 years previous was brand new, full of holes. And you would have been struggling if I look at the great big logistical monsters, and I saw a slide of the new trucks compared to new logs of the day. You wouldn't get one over that road. But this goes back to perhaps also the question was asked before. One of the things that the Australian Army does in preparation for tropical warfare is it slims its transport right down. It basically is a jeep-based army. Everything is carried in jeeps and trailers. There are very few trucks, and the trucks are limited to where the roads are. The Armoured Corps wants to take Grand tanks to these places because they're bigger, they're heavier, but the calculations made they are just too big and too heavy, which is why they stick with the Matilda, which is by that point in time a 15-year-old design, because it's seen as having a lighter footprint, being able to manoeuvre a bit better in these conditions. And still, it's restricted to the roads. Still, it can't really sort of venture into the sort of sandy, swampy type places. So I think, logistic sustainment in terms of the vehicles that we use in these places, in the bits of Southeast Asia that I've seen, is still going to be quite problematic. And we could see ourselves, you're back in we at least have the advantage here if we have helicopters, you can sling stuff under. but it could be that, you know, you need modern equivalent of jeeps, you've got G-Wagon based logistics. Yeah.
Major Jason Selman, headquarters 3 Brigade. In your answer to Captain Garham's question, you said that in the early 80s, when Britain retook South Georgia and the Falkland Islands, not many could have done that kind of force protection. Would you think they could do so again today, and what would be the difficulties in doing so?
I've not done a lot of work on the current day British merchant fleet, but I have been told by various people, including James Goldrick, a very famous, very experienced naval historian, former Australian Navy officer, the last time we were talking about this, that Britain's merchant fleet would just not allow that to be done these days. Britain's grey fleet wouldn't allow it to be done these days. So Britain's current day merchant fleet, there's just not the shipping carrying in Jack anymore to do it. And Australia's merchant shipping is the same. At the beginning of both the First and Second World War, there's a great deal of shipping that, you know, First and Second World War, example, you had, you know, equivalent of ships taken up from trade. You know, the Kanimbla and the Manura, for example, were coastal steamers that were impressed into military service, and we just don't have the locally flagged fleets anymore that would allow us to do such things. Logistical support would be needing to, that sort of logistical support would need to be contracted essentially with, you know, foreign shipping providers.
Doc, can I just pipe up here? This question of sustainment shipping for amphibious operations is one of the things that the Australian Army Research Centre wants to get a grip on and have a look at. And we just said that is one of the questions to the colonels down at CDSS, so hopefully one of them to take it on. But are there any amphibious logisticians in the audience who would like to write a paper on whether or not the Australian National Fleet can sustain our amphibious ambitions? I'd love to hear from you.
Tom Bergman, the Combat Training Centre. My question relates to rehearsals. So in the modern sequence for amphibious operations, they do a command post exercise and plan the operation. They do full-scale dress rehearsals en route to the objective, and then they conduct the operation. The full-scale rehearsals are known as WADA, and what they do is get all the stuff off the ships to shore, do a rehearsal. You can be part of a feint for the operation, and then they backload back onto the ships, proceed to the objective. You also mentioned there were brigade mud models, I guess. So at the tactical level, I would think brigades and battalions did quite a number of map rehearsals. Was there scope in the planning to conduct this WADA type effect en route to the beaches, or was that not part of the overall scheme?
Two things: that all of the divisions had conducted full-scale amphibious landing training in Northern Queensland during 1944. So they'd all gone through, got everybody on ships, put them ashore, and then actually not just rehearsed the landing, then rolled straight into a land-based exercise. Once they're heading for OBO, they do a offloading rehearsal for the troops. It's essentially a test of concept, if you like, between the landing wave diagram, the Navy's plans, the Army's plans. So they load everybody up on Morotai, they steam around the point in Morotai, they get all the troops off, the troops get into their LVTs, their landing craft, etc. They head off to the beach, much to the chagrin of the troops. If the Navy's not happy, the aircraft turn around and do it again. But they're not offloading supplies, they're not offloading vehicles, and only in some instances the troops actually ramps down and come ashore. But they are taking it, they're recognising that, making sure, and we see that why they did so in some confusion which occurs in some places about how important it is making sure that this particular landing craft, the one that is carrying mortars and the one that is carrying mortar ammunition, for example, is in the right place at the right time. And Brigade Porter, who commands the landing operation at Loveline, where the wave, the wave progression actually works exactly as it was trained. He makes comments on about, how he and all his troops have been whinging about the time they spent in the sun, going around and around, their landing craft at Maritime. He says it was all valuable because the landing basically went off without any. So perhaps not to the extent which you described there. They were definitely seeing the need for a rehearsal of the offloading and sorting out the landing waves.
Christine, XO1RR, you mentioned the preponderance or the large amount of information that the planners had access to. You also mentioned a potential weakness in the closer reconnaissance.
Yes.
Are you able to give us a picture of what that reconnaissance planning or the pre-landing reconnaissance was like for everyone?
Pre-landing reconnaissance essentially switched over to the Allied Intelligence Bureau to be conducted by the Services Reconnaissance Department, i.e. Special Operations Australia. Anybody who knows anything about Special Operations Australia knows that it wasn't the most efficient organisation, going back to things like they were dropping operatives in Timor for 3 years and would have been compromised and going straight into Japanese hands, despite the radio operators giving compromised code word. And there was an SOA reconnaissance plan for all the operations. They put operatives in. Often what they would just do would be to grab natives, I'm talking the language here of the reports, they would grab local people and basically abduct them. Grab locals, back out to sea, on a submarine, back to Morotai. Right, tell us about the Japanese. So they had a relatively good understanding us of what the Japanese were, what the Japanese strengths were, where the Japanese were, but they were concentrating in their reconnaissance more on the red vision, more on the enemy, than some of the other aspects of the actual ground, the terrain, which were essential to the operation. There was some good intelligence which came, geographic intelligence which came from some of the Dutch planters and officials and things which have been in these places, which just fed into some of these terrain studies. But a lot of it, I think, was just in the end, people on information collecting missions needed to know what they were looking for. And it was a case of, I think, in some ways, the SOA people weren't briefed as well. In some places, they were focused on the red, what we refer to as red ridge these days, and not, right, let's have a closer look at this particular terrain here, and what's the going to be like for tanks. Because also, they weren't there, these places were quite heavily, the Japanese garrisons in these places, although not strong, but they were concentrated in places. It's also hard for the white folk to move around, particularly in some areas where, throughout the Netherlands, East Indies, because of the Indonesian independence movement and the reputation that the Dutch had, it was always quite hard for operatives to be gaining the support of local people in a lot of instances. So they did very well at this in British Borneo because the locals were disposed towards the British. They didn't do as well at some places like Tarakan and Balikpapan, where there were some who were not very keen on the return of Europeans to their part of the world.